The chamber is open and full of whispers.
What if the brightest witch of her age arrived at Hogwarts, already knowing how the story ended? Let's start at the precise moment everything changed. September 1st, 1991. The mental fracture Hermione Granger's consciousness snapped into focus somewhere between platform 9 and 3/4 and the first bend in the Hogwarts Express route north. One moment she was 19 years old. She was standing in the wreckage of the Great Hall with Fred Weasley's body cooling on the floor beside her, with Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks laid side by side like they were simply sleeping. With the knowledge that Dobby was buried under a headstone she had helped Harry carve with her own shaking hands, the smell of blood and smoke and ancient stone was so real she could taste it. The next moment, she was small. Her teeth were too big. Her hair was enormous, a cloud of brown curls that pressed against the back of a train seat. Her hands, which had gripped a wand through 7 years of war, were the hands of a child who had never cast a spell. The wand itself, 10 3/4 inches, vinewood, dragon heartstring, unyielding, sat across her knees and felt completely wrong. Familiar in the way a photograph of someone you loved felt familiar. Close but not quite right. The train compartment around her was empty. She was alone, which was the first mercy of the day. Hermione sat completely still for approximately 45 seconds. This was not shock, this was assessment. She was on the Hogwarts Express. It was September 1st, 1991. She was 11 years old. Her body was 11 years old. She could feel the difference immediately. The way her magical core sat shallow and undeveloped compared to the deep resonant channels she'd spent 7 years forging. She knew the theory behind the protean charm, non-verbal casting, apparition, advanced legilimency defenses, and fiend fire. Her body could not execute most of them. An 11-year-old's magical core lacked the developed channels for Newt-level spell work. Attempting advanced combat magic would risk magical exhaustion or backfire. She was not, in any conventional sense, a weapon yet. But she was something more dangerous than a weapon. She was informed. Hermione reached up and pressed 2 fingers to her temple. Clinical-grade trauma lived in her nervous system. Bellatrix Lestrange's Cruciatus curse, carved into muscle memory, the phantom weight of the Horcrux locket that had hung around her neck for months, the sensation of weeks of starvation in a frozen forest, the sound of Ron screaming her name from the Malfoy Manor cellar. Her body would flood with cortisol it couldn't process. Her hands would shake, and she wouldn't be able to explain why to anyone. She was the emotional architecture of a war veteran compressed into the neurochemistry of a prepubescent child. She had approximately 30 minutes before the train reached its midpoint, and she needed to find Harry Potter. Hermione allowed herself exactly 90 seconds of grief. She thought of Fred's face, mid-laugh, in a corridor she would never see destroyed. She thought of Remus Lupin, who in this timeline was alive right now, living in poverty somewhere in Britain, isolated and alone, believing his friends had betrayed each other. She thought of Dobby, who was enslaved at Malfoy Manor at this very moment, not knowing he would someday be free. She thought of Cedric Diggory, who was currently 14 years old and had done nothing wrong and would be dead in 4 years if she failed. 90 seconds. Then she stopped, because Hermione Granger was, above all else, a strategist. And grief, however deserved, was not strategic. Not right now. She pulled out a piece of parchment from the school bag at her feet. She'd packed it herself, weeks ago, a lifetime ago, in a bedroom in Crawley that she'd left for the last time this morning, with her parents watching proudly from the platform. She picked up a quill, and she began to write. The must-save registry. The list came quickly because she'd been composing it in her head since the moment she'd oriented herself. Every name was a person she had watched die. Every name was a reason she was sitting on this train instead of in a destroyed Great Hall. Sirius Black, currently rotting in Azkaban for a crime he didn't commit. Imprisoned without trial by Barty Crouch Sr., because Peter Pettigrew framed him perfectly. He had been there for 10 years already and would remain there for 2 more in the original timeline, emerging gaunt and haunted and half-mad from Dementor exposure, before dying at Bellatrix's hand in June 1996. Savable? Pettigrew was on this train right now. The path to Sirius's freedom ran directly through a sleeping rat in a boy's jacket pocket. Remus Lupin, 31 years old, living alone somewhere in Britain, because the wizarding world considered werewolves subhuman and wouldn't employ him. Believed his best friend Sirius was a murderer and traitor. Would die on May 2nd, 1998, in the Battle of Hogwarts alongside his wife Nymphadora. leaving their infant son Teddy an orphan. Savable, contingent on Sirius's freedom and the prevention of the war entirely. Fred Weasley, 13 years old, sitting somewhere on this train right now with his twin brother George, probably already planning something that would give McGonagall a headache, would die on May 2nd, 1998, mid-laugh, in a corridor explosion during the Battle of Hogwarts. The image of George sitting beside his body was one of the memories Hermione had decided she would never fully recover from. Savable if the war never happened. Dobby, enslaved at Malfoy Manor, would die in March 1998 with Bellatrix Lestrange's silver knife in his chest, on a beach in Devon, saying Harry's name. Savable, though the mechanism was complicated. Dobby's freedom was tied to Lucius Malfoy's diary scheme, which Hermione intended to intercept entirely. Cedric Diggory, 14 years old, a Hufflepuff prefect who had done absolutely nothing wrong and would be murdered on June 24, 1995, because Voldemort said kill the spare as casually as ordering dinner. Savable if Voldemort never returned to a body. She paused here, because the list could keep going. Colin Creevey, Lavender Brown, 50 people in the Battle of Hogwarts alone. Every single person who had died in both Wizarding Wars was alive right now, in 1991. Alive and unaware and completely unprepared for what was coming. If Voldemort never returned to a body, none of them had to die. The entire war could be prevented. That was the mission, not just saving individual names on a list, dismantling the entire architecture of Voldemort's immortality before he ever had the chance to use it. Hermione folded the parchment and tucked it into her bag. Then she stood up, straightened her robes, and went to find Harry Potter. The rat in the pocket. The train corridor was crowded with first-years dragging trunks and peering through compartment windows. Hermione moved through them with the focused efficiency of someone who had navigated war zones and knew exactly where she was going. She found Harry's compartment 2/3 of the way down the train. The door was slightly ajar. Through the gap she could see a thin boy with messy black hair and glasses that were slightly too large for his face, sitting across from a red-haired boy with freckles. A rat sat on the red-haired boy's knee, apparently asleep. The rat. Hermione stopped in the corridor and made herself breathe. Peter Pettigrew was 3 feet away from her. The man who had betrayed James and Lily Potter to Voldemort. The man who had murdered 12 muggles with a single curse. Cut off his own finger and transformed into a rat to frame Sirius Black for everything. The man who would cut off his own hand in a graveyard in 1995 to resurrect the darkest wizard of the century. He was sleeping in Ron Weasley's pocket. She could not grab the rat now. She was 11 years old, with an undeveloped magical core. The Animagus reversal spell, the blue-white flash that Lupin and Sirius had used in the Shrieking Shack in 3rd year, was Newt-level untransfiguration. Her body could not cast it. Even if she somehow managed it, she had no proof, no credibility, and no adult ally who would believe a first-year Muggle-born who grabbed another student's pet and tried to force it to transform. She had to be strategic. Hermione composed her expression into something that was not the battle-hardened assessment of a 19-year-old war veteran, slid open the compartment door, and sat down. "Hello?" she said. "Do you mind? Everywhere else seems to be full." Harry looked up. His eyes were green, startlingly green, Lily's eyes in James's face, and in them Hermione saw something she recognized immediately. He was a child who had never had a friend. Every interaction he'd ever had outside of Hogwarts had been either neglect or cruelty, and he had the careful stillness of someone who didn't quite believe kindness was real yet. She knew him, loved him, actually in the way you loved people you'd fought beside and nearly died for. But he didn't know her yet, and she couldn't let any of that show. "Of course," Harry said. "I'm Harry Potter. I'm Hermione Granger," she said, and watched Ron's eyes go wide at Harry's name. She didn't look at the rat. She deliberately didn't look at the rat. "Is that a real owl? He's beautiful." Harry's face transformed when he looked at Hedwig's cage. "Yeah, I just got her. She's called Hedwig." "That's from the History of Magic," Hermione said, and then stopped herself. In the original timeline, she would have launched into a recitation of everything she'd read about Hogwarts, demonstrating her knowledge like a shield against the fear of not belonging. She wasn't going to do that. She knew where that led. She knew Ron's future opinion of her, knew that she'd spent the entire first half of 1st year being quietly lonely while trying too hard. Instead, she said, "That's a really good name. Did you choose it yourself?" Harry blinked, clearly expecting something different. "Yeah. I'm Ron Weasley, the red-haired boy said, less suspicious of her than he was of most Slytherins he'd been warned about, mostly because she'd just complimented his friend's owl-naming abilities. Nice to meet you, Hermione said. She looked at the rat on his knee. How old is he? Ron shrugged. Scabbers? He was Percy's before he got an owl. He's been in the family for ages, actually. How old would you say? I don't know. 12 years, maybe. My mum would know. 12 years, Hermione repeated, keeping her voice entirely casual. That's impressive. Common garden rats usually only live about 3 years. Even magical ones don't typically make it past 10. Ron looked at Scabbers with new eyes. I never thought about it. I read about it somewhere, Hermione said. In a book on magical creatures. She reached into her bag and pulled out the chocolate frogs she'd bought on the platform. Do you want one? I bought too many. The conversation shifted to chocolate frogs and famous wizard cards, and Hermione let it. She'd planted the seed about Scabbers' impossible age. That was enough for now. She had months before she needed to act on Pettigrew, and she needed to plant many more seeds before she moved. She needed to become Harry's first real friend. Not Ron, alongside Ron, and sooner than in the original timeline. She needed to do it genuinely, because she did genuinely care about him, but she also needed the proximity. She needed to be close enough to Harry to protect him, to manage what was coming, to be the person he turned to when things went wrong. Are you nervous? Harry asked her, and she realized he'd been watching her face. A little, she said, which was so vast an understatement that she almost laughed. Are you? A bit, he admitted. Then, like someone testing whether the ground would hold, I didn't know anything about magic until a month ago. I'm probably going to be rubbish at everything. I doubt that, Hermione said. And she meant it. She'd watched Harry Potter cast a Patronus at 13, survive a killing curse twice, and face Voldemort 6 separate times. I think you'll be fine. Harry looked at her with the careful hope of a child who didn't quite believe good things were real. You think so? Yes, Hermione said simply. The deepest problem, as the train moved north and the landscape shifted from city to countryside. Hermione watched Harry and Ron argue about Quidditch teams, with the easy friendship of people who'd known each other for 30 minutes, and she let herself think about the problem she couldn't solve yet. The scar. Harry Potter carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul in the lightning bolt scar on his forehead. This was the Horcrux that had never been named as a Horcrux in canon until the very end, the one Dumbledore had known about and kept secret for years, the one that had made Harry a walking piece of Voldemort's immortality. In the original timeline, the scar Horcrux was destroyed by a precise confluence of circumstances that would be impossible to replicate in this timeline. Voldemort had cast the killing curse at Harry in the Forbidden Forest. Harry had survived because Voldemort had rebuilt his body, using Harry's blood in the Priori Incantatem ritual. And that blood tether, Lily's ancient protection living inside Voldemort's own veins, had meant that Harry couldn't die while Voldemort lived. The soul fragment had been destroyed. Harry had returned from the liminal space between death and life. The scar had faded. 3 conditions had aligned simultaneously. The blood tether from the 1995 resurrection ritual, Harry's willing walk to his death invoking ancient sacrificial magic, and the Elder Wand's refusal to kill its true master. Remove any one of those conditions, and Harry died. Here was the problem that kept her awake in ways nothing else could. If she prevented Voldemort from ever returning to a body, if she dismantled his Horcrux infrastructure completely, if she destroyed every anchor he'd created, then the 1995 resurrection ritual would never happen. The blood tether would never form, and the scar Horcrux would remain inside Harry's head with no safe method to remove it. Basilisk venom would destroy the Horcrux, but it would also destroy Harry. Fiendfire would incinerate everything. The sword of Gryffindor required driving it through the container beyond magical repair, and for a living host, that meant death. Every destruction method she knew of worked on objects. Harry was not an object. She had 5 years to solve this problem before the Triwizard Tournament. Realistically, she had less. Every year she delayed was a year during which something could go wrong. The only people she could potentially consult were Dumbledore, who in 1991 had not yet confirmed Horcruxes existed, but whose intellectual resources were unmatched, Madame Pomfrey, who had extensive healing magic but no dark arts expertise, and Professor Flitwick, a former dueling champion whose half-goblin heritage gave him unique magical perspectives, and who was the most technically skilled charms practitioner on staff. She could not approach Snape yet. She knew his true loyalty, had watched him die in the Shrieking Shack, had read his memories, knew that every action of his adult life had been an act of love for Lily Potter. But Snape was a legilimens of extraordinary skill. He would strip her secrets bare at first glance, and his first instinct would be to take the information directly to Dumbledore, on his own terms, cutting her out of the equation entirely. The solution she needed didn't exist yet. She would have to help build it. But first things first, before she could solve the scar problem, she needed to establish credibility. Before she could establish credibility, she needed to expose Peter Pettigrew. Before she could expose Peter Pettigrew, she needed to survive the sorting. And the sorting posed its own extraordinary complication. The sorting hat knows everything. This was not widely understood by students, who thought of it as a magical hat that somehow intuited personality. But Hermione had spent 7 years in the wizarding world, and she understood exactly what it was. The hat read the wearer's conscious and subconscious mind. Memories, abilities, character, potential, every layer of personality. When the hat touched her head tonight, it would see everything. The Battle of Hogwarts, every Horcrux location, Snape's true allegiance, Dumbledore's plan to let Harry die, the deaths of 50 people, 7 years of a war that hadn't happened yet. The Sorting Hat was about to receive a complete download of the next 7 years of wizarding history from a war veteran wearing an 11-year-old's body. This was simultaneously her greatest risk and her most significant opportunity. The risk was obvious. If the hat shared what it saw with Dumbledore, or any other faculty member, her foreknowledge would be exposed. Every plan would be compromised. She'd be brought in front of the ministry, studied, possibly have her memory modified. But the opportunity, the hat had never in 1,000 years of continuous operation been shown to share a student's private thoughts with anyone. Not even the headmaster. It kept its own counsel absolutely. It was, in a strange sense, the most trustworthy confidant in the entire building. And beyond trust, there was utility. If the hat saw her complete strategic map, it would understand the stakes. It might, within its limited operational capacity, become a silent co-conspirator. It couldn't act, it sat on a stool and sorted students. But it also could not be compelled to testify. Her secrets would be safer inside a 1,000-year-old sentient artifact than in any human mind. The question was house selection, and it was not a sentimental question. She could make a case for every house. She had the courage of Gryffindor. She'd walked into a war. She had the intellect of Ravenclaw. Her mind was her primary weapon. She had the cunning of Slytherin. She was executing a covert operation to rewrite history. She had the loyalty of Hufflepuff. She had come back through time for the people she loved. The strategic case for Gryffindor was overwhelming, and she had made it in her head a dozen times already. She needed to be in Harry's common room. She needed physical proximity to Scabbers, who lived in the Gryffindor boys' dormitory. She needed the established trust of Minerva McGonagall, who would become her head of house, and who was the specific adult she had identified as the key to the Pettigrew operation. She needed the social credibility that came from being Harry Potter's housemate, rather than some girl from another table who happened to be friendly. Ravenclaw would place her near the Room of Requirement and the Diadem Horcrux on the 7th floor, but she could access the 7th floor from any house. Slytherin would give her intelligence on Death Eater children, but would destroy her ability to befriend Harry openly, and would position her in direct opposition to everything she was trying to protect. Hufflepuff was not strategically useful in the ways she needed. Gryffindor was not sentiment. It was strategy. The train began to slow as the Scottish Highlands darkened outside the windows. Arrival? Hogsmeade Station in the dark was exactly as she remembered it, except that she was seeing it from the wrong height. She'd grown 3 inches between first year and fifth, and looking up at the familiar mountains and the first glimpse of Hogwarts across the lake was disorienting in a specific way she hadn't anticipated. Small body, enormous memories. Furs years over here. Hagrid's voice boomed across the platform, and Hermione felt something crack in her chest. He was enormous and loud and carrying his pink umbrella and completely unaware that she knew him, had shared meals with him, had defended his giant half-brother before the ministry, had stood at his side at a funeral. He was looking at her like she was a stranger. She followed the cluster of first years down to the boats, finding herself in a small vessel with Harry, Ron, and a nervous round-faced boy who introduced himself as Neville Longbottom. Neville was clutching a toad to his chest with the concentration of someone who had already lost it twice. "It's okay," Hermione said quietly, as the boats began moving across the black water toward the castle lights. "Toads are actually quite difficult to keep track of. You're doing fine." He had no reason to trust her yet. But she knew him, knew the man he would become, knew the extraordinary courage that lived inside what everyone would assume was timidity. She would not overlook Neville Longbottom this time. The castle rose out of the water, and the darkness, towers and turrets and ancient stones that had seen 1,000 years of children crossing this lake for the first time. Hermione had crossed it 6 times in the original timeline, forward once, and then the return journeys at the end of each year. She had never stopped finding it beautiful. She let herself feel it, just for a moment, the beauty of something she'd thought she'd never see again. Then the boats grounded on the far shore, and she was moving again. McGonagall in the antechamber. Professor McGonagall met them in the entrance hall, exactly as in the original timeline, stern-faced and precise in her emerald robes, explaining the sorting ceremony in terms that sent half the first years into nervous spirals. Hermione watched her carefully. Minerva McGonagall was, in her estimation, one of the genuinely great witches of the age, competent, principled, occasionally inflexible, and possessed of a bone-deep commitment to her students that she would rather die than admit to publicly. She had dueled Umbridge with cold fury. She had stood at the gates of Hogwarts during the battle and said, "I've always wanted to use that spell." She had cried silently at Harry's supposed death, and then kept fighting. Hermione was going to use her. She hated the word, but it was accurate. She was going to direct this woman's intelligence and authority toward an outcome McGonagall herself would have chosen if she'd known what Hermione knew. That didn't make it not manipulation. It made it necessary manipulation, which was a distinction Hermione had made her peace with somewhere around age 15. The antechamber was full of nervous first-years. Draco Malfoy was already performing social hierarchy, selecting Harry for a networking conversation, using his family name as a credential, turning away Ron as a blood traitor's son. Hermione watched this with the weary recognition of someone who'd seen this dynamic play out in real time. She didn't intervene. Harry's rejection of Malfoy on the train, the moment he'd chosen the Weasleys over the Malfoys, was important. It was the first independent moral choice Harry Potter made in the wizarding world. She wouldn't take it from him. The ghosts drifted through the wall and sent half the antechamber screaming, and then McGonagall returned and led them into the Great Hall. The sorting, the hat sees everything. The Great Hall was exactly as she remembered, and the ceiling was showing a clear September night, and the candles floated exactly the right way, and Hermione had to spend 3 seconds talking herself down from a wave of grief so severe it nearly buckled her knees. She was here. She was really here. The last time she'd been in this room, she'd been stepping over bodies. The sorting hat sat on its stool, old, patched frayed along the brim, utterly ordinary looking. She knew what it was. She knew what was about to happen when it touched her head. The sorting began alphabetically. Abbott, Hannah. The hat took 30 seconds, then shouted Hufflepuff. The sequence continued. Lavender Brown to Gryffindor, Millicent Bulstrode to Slytherin. Hermione watched each sorting with the particular attention of someone who knew what these children would become, who they would fight beside, who she would need, and who would need her. Granger, Hermione. She walked forward. The great hall was quiet. She sat on the stool. McGonagall placed the hat on her head. The darkness was immediate and complete. Then a voice, dry, ancient, deeply surprised. Well, I have sorted 4,216 students in this school. The hat said slowly, I have never encountered anything like you. I imagine not. You're not 11 years old. My body is. No, definitely not. The hat was quiet for a moment, and she felt it moving through her memories, not intrusively, but with the careful attention of something reading a very dense text. She let it look. She had decided to let it look. The Battle of Hogwarts, the Horcruxes, Snape's true allegiance, the Elder Wand. Another pause. Longer. You know everything. Not everything, but enough. The fragment of Voldemort's soul in the boy's scar. The hat was quiet for what must have been 15 seconds. In the great hall, the students would be shifting, wondering what was taking so long. A near hat stall, 5 more seconds and it would officially be won. Gryffindor, the hat said finally, and its tone was not the bored certainty it used for easy sortings. It was something closer to respect. Not because you're brave, though you are, because you're right. Gryffindor gives you what you need. I hope you know what you're doing, child. So do I. Gryffindor. The table in red and gold erupted in applause. Hermione walked toward it, sat down at the end of the bench, and looked back at the stool in time to see McGonagall place the hat on a small boy with glasses. Harry Potter's sorting took 4 minutes and 12 seconds. She counted. The hat argued with him. She couldn't hear it, but she knew what was being said, knew that Harry's mind was saying, "Not Slytherin, not Slytherin," with the desperation of a child who already associated that name with everything wrong in his world. "Gryffindor?" Harry practically ran to the table. He looked relieved, slightly stunned, and so young it hurt. Hermione shifted down the bench, leaving the space beside her empty. Harry sat in it. He looked at her with the surprised gratitude of someone who hadn't expected anyone to save him a seat. "Well done," she said quietly. "Thanks," he said. "You too." A pause. "The hat took ages with you." "Difficult case," she said. "I think it wasn't sure what to do with me." Ron dropped into the seat on Harry's other side, and the feast began, and the three of them were already a unit, not forged in a bathroom with a troll, not assembled from loneliness and shared danger in October. Assembled here, now, over chicken and roast potatoes, in the first hour of the first night, because Hermione had decided that this time every choice would be intentional. The feast rolled on around her. Dumbledore stood and gave his opening remarks. Hermione noted Professor Quirrell's turban with the careful neutrality of someone cataloging a threat. She noted the way Quirrell moved, the way he avoided eye contact, the particular stiffness of his neck as he turned. The garlic was present. She could smell it from 3 tables away. Stronger than it should have been, covering something. Voldemort was in this room right now, a parasite on a stuttering professor, weaker than he'd been in 50 years, barely capable of coherent thought. He was here, and Hermione was here, and she was the only person in the building who knew where to look. She ate her chicken. She laughed at something Ron said about Percy's prefect badge. She made sure Harry ate enough. She knew the Dursleys' deprivation patterns, knew that he was calibrated for scarcity, and that the abundance of the feast would overwhelm him before he'd eaten what he needed. "Have more," she said, pushing the serving dish toward him. "You should eat." "Okay," he said, and took more. Hermione looked up at the teacher's table and found Dumbledore watching her, not with suspicion, with interest. Sharp, intelligent interest. The kind of look he gave things that didn't fit his established models. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away. She already knew about Dumbledore's legilimency, the casual surface reading he did during eye contact. Not deep invasion, just the habit of a man who had spent 60 years gathering information from faces. She had decided to let him see what she wanted him to see. A Muggle-born first year, who was perhaps unusually composed, unusually perceptive, and perhaps unusually unafraid for a child at her first sorting feast. Nothing that would alarm him yet. Just enough to make him pay attention. She would need his attention very soon. The first night, dormitory and planning, the Gryffindor common room, was warm and red. She'd spent 7 years in this room, had done homework in every corner of it, had planned a war from the fireplace end, and argued in the window alcoves, and sat on the floor doing nothing in particular, on quiet afternoons before everything went catastrophically wrong. She stood in the entrance, and felt, briefly, completely undone. Then, Lavender Brown walked into the back of her, and apologized. And Hermione pulled herself together and went upstairs. The girls' dormitory had 5 beds, 5 trunks, and 4 other first-year girls who were primarily concerned with the quality of their bedding and whether Hogwarts had better food than expected. Parvati Patil wanted to talk about divination. Lavender Brown wanted to talk about boys. Hermione responded in monosyllables and unpacked her trunk with the efficiency of someone who had made camp in frozen fields and knew how to organize limited space. When the others were asleep, she lay in the darkness with her eyes open, running her plan. The Pettigrew operation was the most urgent priority. Peter Pettigrew, sleeping as a rat in the boys' dormitory 1 floor below, was simultaneously the greatest immediate threat and the greatest immediate opportunity. Exposing him freed Sirius. Freeing Sirius gave Harry a guardian, and gave Hermione an adult ally who had every reason to help her, and the credibility she would build by identifying Pettigrew, an 11-year-old who'd figured out what the entire ministry had missed for a decade, would make everything that came after possible. But she had to be methodical. She was 11 years old, with no credibility, and no proof, and no ability to cast the reversal spell herself. She needed an adult to cast it, an adult with the authority to act on what they found, and a paper trail of evidence that made her look like a brilliant detective rather than someone operating on foreknowledge she couldn't explain. The target was McGonagall. McGonagall was a registered animagus herself. She would understand the significance of an unregistered one. She had known the marauders. She had been present during Sirius's arrest. She had presumably spent a decade with a private suppressed doubt about whether it had all happened exactly as Barty Crouch had declared. Hermione was going to hand her the key to a door she'd been standing outside for 10 years. The approach needed to be careful. An 11-year-old approaching a professor with a theory about a disguised murderer in the school was either brilliant or insane, and the difference between those two categories came down entirely to how the evidence was presented. She needed to make the case from publicly available information. She needed to make it look like detective work, not prophecy. She would spend the first 2 months building the circumstantial evidence. She would ask McGonagall a precise, apparently innocent question about animagus detection. She would lay out the case, the impossible age of the rat, the missing toe, the 1981 newspaper records about Peter Pettigrew that were available in the Hogwarts library. She would give McGonagall permission to investigate something she should have investigated years ago. And then Dumbledore would get involved, and Pettigrew would confess under veritaserum, and Sirius would walk free before Christmas. It was a good plan. It was a solid plan. It had 17 separate ways it could go wrong, and she had contingencies for 11 of them. She turned onto her side, closed her eyes, and told herself to sleep. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them together and breathed slowly, the way she'd learned from Luna Lovegood of all people, during the weeks they'd spent in the Lovegood house after the battle. 4 counts in. Hold. 4 counts out. She was here. She was alive. Nobody was dead yet. She had a chance. That was more than she'd had this morning. October 1991. Building the case. The first weeks of Hogwarts term were, in the original timeline, a period of social disaster for Hermione Granger. She had been bossy and lonely and desperate in ways she hadn't recognized until years later, raising her hand constantly to fill a silence that was really just the sound of not belonging. She had spent October largely friendless. Ron had called her an insufferable know-it-all, and the Halloween troll incident had forced a friendship that should have developed naturally over months. This time was different. She didn't raise her hand in every class. She let other students answer first, assessed their knowledge level, and spoke when she had something specific to contribute, rather than performing competence as a defense mechanism. She sat beside Harry in classes they shared, and asked him genuine questions about what he thought rather than telling him what to think. She laughed at Ron's jokes when they were actually funny, which was more often than she'd given him credit for in the original timeline. The social architecture of their friendship assembled itself faster and more solidly than it had before. By the second week of October, Harry and Ron were saving her a seat at meals without discussing it. By the third week, they were doing homework together in the common room as a matter of course. The troll incident hadn't happened. Quirrell had no reason to release one yet, but it hadn't needed to. They were already a unit. This was the foundation. Everything else required this foundation. But while the surface of her days was homework and classes and meals, the real work was happening in the Hogwarts library on Thursday afternoons. Hermione had identified the specific sources she needed, with the precision of someone who'd spent 7 years developing research skills in conditions ranging from comfortable to catastrophic. The Hogwarts Library's Daily Prophet archive extended back decades. The relevant records from 1981 were there. She'd verified this by asking Madame Pince a casual question about archive availability during her second visit to the library, framing it as a general interest in wizarding historical newspapers. She found the articles about Peter Pettigrew's death in the third week of October. They were exactly where she'd known they would be. 3 separate pieces, covering the initial incident, the Ministry's official conclusion, and Sirius Black's subsequent capture. She read them with the detached professionalism of a researcher, rather than the grief of someone who knew every person named in them. And she made careful notes on a separate piece of parchment. The facts presented without context were these. Peter Pettigrew had been killed by Sirius Black on November 1st, 1981, in a London Street confrontation. The only remains recovered were a single finger. 12 Muggle bystanders had also died, killed by an explosion attributed to Sirius. Sirius Black had been apprehended at the scene, laughing, and had been taken directly to Azkaban without trial. Those were the publicly available facts. What Hermione also noted, from a smaller article in the same archive, was the Ministry's official classification of Peter Pettigrew as an unregistered anything. He hadn't been. The Ministry had no record of Pettigrew being an animagus, because he'd never registered, and because no one had ever thought to ask. 1 finger recovered. 3-year maximum lifespan for common rats. 12 years of impossible survival in a family that had never questioned it. The case built itself from public record. She just needed to present it to the right person. Approaching McGonagall? The perfect question. Professor McGonagall held office hours on Wednesday evenings from 6 to 7:30. In the original timeline, Hermione had never used them in first year. She hadn't needed to, and the dynamic between them had been cordial but formal, until much later. She knocked on McGonagall's office door on the last Wednesday of October, at exactly 6:15. "Come in, Miss Granger." McGonagall's office was precisely organized in the way of someone who considered disorder a personal failing. Stacks of essays arranged by year group, quills in a ceramic holder, a tartan tin of shortbread biscuits on the corner of the desk that she never offered to students but occasionally ate from between appointments. There was a framed photograph of the Gryffindor Quidditch team from 1967 on the wall behind her. "I had a research question," Hermione said, sitting down in the chair across the desk without being asked. "Not rude, miss. Just the efficiency of someone who didn't waste movement." She caught McGonagall's slight eyebrow raise at the confidence of it and modulated accordingly, straightening slightly. "If that's all right, Professor. What is your question?" "I've been reading ahead in Transfiguration Theory," Hermione said. "The section on animagi transformation. I understood the principles of the transformation itself, but I couldn't find a clear explanation in any of the standard texts of how one would detect an unregistered animagus. The books discuss registered animagi and how to verify registration, but the detection question specifically seems to be absent." McGonagall's expression was entirely professional. "That is indeed a gap in standard educational materials. Detection of unregistered animagi is considered advanced magic. It isn't typically covered until NEWT level, if at all." "I understand. I was just curious about the principle. Is there a reversal spell that would force an animagus back to human form? Something that would work even without the subject's cooperation?" "There is," McGonagall said. "The animagus reversal charm is a specialized on transfiguration. Quite advanced work, but a straightforward enough principle. It triggers the involuntary reversal of the transformation, regardless of the subject's intention. A standard animal would be entirely unaffected by it. The spell would simply find nothing to reverse. So it would be harmless to a normal animal, but would reveal a transformed wizard. In theory, one could cast it on any animal with suspicious characteristics and know definitively whether it was an animagus or simply an animal." McGonagall studied her with the expression of someone connecting observations. "What prompted this particular line of inquiry, Miss Granger? This is unusually specialized research for a first year." Here was the pivot. Hermione had planned every word of what came next. "I was reading the library's Daily Prophet archive," she said. "Historical research. I found the 1981 articles about Peter Pettigrew and the Sirius Black arrest." A microsecond of stillness in McGonagall's expression. Almost invisible, Hermione caught it. "I see," McGonagall said carefully. "I noticed something that seemed like a discrepancy," Hermione continued, her voice entirely level. "The articles said Pettigrew was killed and only a single finger was recovered. I'd also just been reading about the lifespan of magical animals, and I happen to know that Ron Weasley has a rat called Scabbers that his older brother had for approximately 12 years before passing him down, which is well beyond the natural lifespan of even a magical rat. And Scabbers is missing a toe on his front right paw." The silence in McGonagall's office lasted 4 full seconds. "One finger," McGonagall said very quietly. "One finger," Hermione confirmed. "I might be completely wrong. It might just be a coincidence. An old rat with a missing toe and an unusually long life. But I thought, given your expertise in animagi and your knowledge of that era, you would know much better than I would whether this was worth investigating. It's your area of magic. You would be able to evaluate it much more accurately than I could." She'd framed it perfectly. She wasn't accusing anyone. She wasn't claiming foreknowledge. She was an unusually perceptive 11-year-old, presenting a pattern she'd noticed through legitimate archival research and bringing it to the relevant expert, deferring to that expert's judgment. She was giving McGonagall permission to investigate something McGonagall had the power to resolve. McGonagall's hands were flat on her desk. "How long have you had this theory, Miss Granger?" "I started finding the pieces last week," Hermione said. "I kept waiting for there to be an obvious flaw in the reasoning. I couldn't find one. That's why I came to you." "You did the right thing," McGonagall said. Her voice had shifted from professional to something quieter and more deliberate. "Leave this with me, Miss Granger, and please don't discuss this with anyone, not even Harry or Ron, until I've had time to look into it." "Of course, Professor." Hermione stood, nodded once, and left. In the corridor outside, she pressed her back against the stone wall and closed her eyes. Her heart was hammering. She'd known it would work. She'd planned it to work. But the knowing and the doing were different things, and her body hadn't been informed about the certainty of her plan. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them together. 4 counts in. Hold. 4 counts out. The mechanism was in motion. The headmaster is informed. McGonagall went to Dumbledore that same evening. Hermione knew this, not from observation but from inference. McGonagall was not a woman who sat on actionable information overnight, and the question of Sirius Black's guilt was not a small one. She had been McGonagall's student. She had been present at the original arrest. Whatever private doubts Dumbledore himself had harbored about the verdict, McGonagall had presumably suppressed hers under the weight of institutional conclusion. Hermione was being given something more powerful than evidence. She was giving these 2 people permission to trust the doubt they had never voiced. She spent the next 3 days behaving with complete normalcy. Classes, homework, meals, a game of exploding snap with Ron that she lost deliberately because winning every game was its own kind of problem. She helped Harry with his transfiguration essay, and did not write it for him, though the temptation was considerable. On the 3rd day, McGonagall requested her presence during morning break. "I spoke with the headmaster," McGonagall said when Hermione sat down. "He has arranged for a formal examination of the Weasley family's rat. It will be conducted tomorrow morning, during the time when the boys are in class, to avoid disruption. Professor Dumbledore would like to speak with you this afternoon. I should tell you, Miss Granger, that what you've brought to us, if you're right, is not a small matter." "I understand," Hermione said. "Do you think I'm right, Professor?" McGonagall looked at her for a long moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that you have asked exactly the questions I should have asked 10 years ago." Dumbledore's office. The first meeting, Dumbledore's office was exactly as she remembered. The whirring silver instruments, the portraits of previous headmasters sleeping or pretending to sleep along the walls, Fawkes the Phoenix on his perch, the sorting hat on its shelf, the pensive on the cabinet. She had been in this office perhaps a dozen times in the original timeline. It had always made her feel slightly off balance, which she had eventually understood was deliberate. Dumbledore arranged his environment to give himself observational advantage over visitors. Everything slightly overwhelming, the curiosities drawing the eye while he watched the face. She looked at the instruments and the portraits with genuine interest, keeping her expression open and curious and appropriately awed. 11 years old in a headmaster's office for the first time. She played the role honestly because it was partially true. She had never been in this office at 11, and even with 7 years of future knowledge behind her eyes, there was something about the quality of the afternoon light through the tower windows that was genuinely beautiful. "Please, sit down, Hermione," Dumbledore said. He was watching her with those sharp blue eyes, and she felt the feather-light brush of surface legilimency and let it find exactly what she wanted it to find. A clever girl who'd done library research, who was nervous but composed, who was genuinely uncertain about whether her theory was correct. "Thank you for seeing me, Professor," she said. "Thank you for bringing this to Professor McGonagall's attention," he said. "I understand you found the connection through the Daily Prophet archives, and the age of the rat was so far outside normal parameters that I couldn't explain it any other way." She paused. "Was I wrong to come forward?" "If I was wrong, you were not wrong to come forward," Dumbledore said. "On the contrary, you noticed something that, I confess, I should have noticed myself." He said this without apparent embarrassment, but she saw the quality of stillness in him that indicated genuine discomfort being managed. "The examination will take place tomorrow morning. I wanted to speak with you before then, to evaluate whether I'm trustworthy," Hermione said. Dumbledore's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "To understand how a first-year student came to be researching the deaths of wizards from a decade before she was born. I'm interested in history," Hermione said, "and I read the Hogwarts Library archive systematically. I noticed the discrepancy because I happened to have been reading about animagi transformation for extra credit on the same day I read the 1981 articles." She met his eyes directly. It was luck and pattern recognition. He was reading her surface thoughts during this eye contact. She let him read composure, genuine intelligence, and the specific anxiety of an 11-year-old who wasn't sure whether she'd done something impressive or something troubling. "Nothing more. Pattern recognition," Dumbledore repeated, with an expression that suggested he was filing information away at speed. "A valuable skill, and one, I suspect, that will continue to serve you well at Hogwarts." A pause and then, I want you to know, Hermione, that whatever we find tomorrow, the matter will be handled appropriately. You have done the right thing in bringing this forward, and I won't forget it. She understood the message underneath the words. He was telling her she had made an ally, that the information she'd provided would not be discarded. Thank you, Professor, she said. The reveal Peter Pettigrew exposed Hermione was in charms class when the examination happened. She sat through Flitwick's lesson on the levitation charm, with her wand moving precisely, her feather rising on the second attempt, and her attention fixed somewhere else entirely. She knew what was happening, one floor below. She'd seen it happen in the Shrieking Shack 2 years later in the original timeline. The blue-white flash of the reversal spell. The grotesque moment of transformation. Pettigrew's rat-like face blinking in torchlight. Small and balding and cornered. Ron's reaction was what she couldn't see and had to imagine. She would need to be careful with Ron. He'd had Scabbers for 3 years and didn't know what the rat was. Had no reason to associate his pet with any of this. The loss of the rat was nothing. The knowledge that he'd been sleeping in the same bed as the man who'd betrayed Harry's parents was something else. She went to find Ron at lunch. He was sitting at the Gryffindor table with Harry, and both of them had the blank, stunned expression of people who had been informed of something enormous. Hermione sat down beside Harry. You know, Harry said. It wasn't a question. I was told this morning that Professor Dumbledore was going to examine Scabbers, Hermione said carefully. I'd noticed some things about him that seemed strange. I brought them to Professor McGonagall. I didn't know for certain what they'd find. Ron was staring at his empty plate. He was my rat, Ron said. I slept in the same dormitory as him. I know, Hermione said. I'm sorry, Ron. Is it true he actually betrayed Harry's parents? Under Veritaserum, which they'll administer this afternoon, he'll confirm everything, Hermione said, and realized she'd said it with more certainty than she should have. I think he will, she corrected. The evidence is very strong. Harry was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Sirius Black didn't do it. No, Hermione said. He's been in Azkaban for 10 years for something he didn't do. Yes. Harry looked at his plate, then back at her. How long have you known about this? I started putting the pieces together a few weeks ago. I couldn't do anything by myself. I needed an adult who could cast the reversal spell, and had the authority to act on what they found. She met Harry's eyes. I went to McGonagall as soon as I was sure the pattern made sense. Harry looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she'd seen on his face in other circumstances. The expression of someone recalibrating his understanding of another person. You figured this out on your own? In the first month of school? I read a lot, she said. Ron made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You read a lot, he repeated. Brilliant. Pettigrew's confession and Sirius's freedom. The formal examination of Peter Pettigrew took place in Dumbledore's office that afternoon, with Dumbledore, McGonagall, and 2 Aurors present. Pettigrew, restrained and cornered and without the option of transformation, confessed comprehensively, under Veritaserum. He had been the Potter's secret keeper, not Sirius. He had betrayed James and Lily to Voldemort willingly, not under duress. He had murdered the 12 Muggles by blasting the street with his own wand, cut off his own finger, and transformed, leaving Sirius alone at the scene. He had spent 12 years as a rat in the Weasley family, waiting for any sign that Voldemort might return. The dark mark on his arm was visible and physically present. Additional corroboration that no Veritaserum could have manufactured. Minister for Magic Cornelius Fudge, barely a year into his tenure, arrived at Hogwarts within 2 hours of being contacted. He arrived, Hermione understood from later accounts filtered through Ron and Harry, with the particular energy of a politician who recognized both a disaster and an opportunity. The disaster was that the Ministry had imprisoned an innocent man for a decade without trial. The opportunity was that correcting that disaster while Voldemort remained vanished and powerless was infinitely cheaper than having it surface later. Dumbledore's guidance was, as always, decisive. Sirius Black's formal exoneration papers were filed within 48 hours. The legal process for establishing him as Harry's rightful guardian, the process that had been denied at every turn in the original timeline, because no one had believed him innocent, moved with the efficiency of a ministry that wanted this resolved quietly and completely. Sirius Black was released from Azkaban on November 15, 1991. Hermione knew this from the Daily Prophet, which read a front-page article with a photograph of a man who looked 10 years older than his age, gaunt and pale and blinking in unfamiliar sunlight. The article noted that he had been imprisoned without trial, and that the Ministry of Magic offered its deepest apologies for this miscarriage of justice. She read the article 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her trunk under her winter robes. Harry received a letter from Dumbledore the same day the article ran. He read it at breakfast, and his hands were shaking by the end of it. He looked up at Hermione with eyes that were doing something complicated. "He wants to meet me," Harry said. "Sirius, my godfather. He stopped. "Dumbledore says he has legal guardianship. That I don't have to go back to the Dursleys for Christmas. That I could—" "You could spend Christmas with your godfather," Hermione said. Harry put the letter down carefully, with the particular care of someone handling something that might dissolve if held too hard. "This happened because of you," he said. "It happened because of a 12-year-old rat with a missing toe," Hermione said. "I just noticed." "Hermione," his voice was very quiet. "Thank you." This boy who had spent the first 11 years of his life being told he wasn't wanted, who had learned to make himself small to avoid his uncle's anger, who had never had Christmas with people who loved him. She thought of the parallel version of this child walking into a forest at 17 to let himself be murdered. "You're welcome, Harry," she said. Quirrell, the second operation. With Pettigrew exposed and Sirius's exoneration in process, Hermione had established the credibility she needed for the next phase. She had one meeting with Dumbledore before Christmas break to brief him on Quirrell. She requested it through McGonagall, framing it as a follow-up concern from her Pettigrew research. She had noticed other things, she said, that she wanted to bring to his attention. Dumbledore received her in his office on a Tuesday evening in late November. "I wanted to tell you something," Hermione said, "about Professor Quirrell." Dumbledore's expression did not change. "Yes? I've been watching him since term started. I noticed several things that seemed unusual." She laid them out precisely. The garlic smell that was disproportionate to any natural use, stronger on days when the defense classroom was particularly warm. The specific stiffness of his neck, which was not the stiffness of injury, but the stiffness of someone maintaining a fixed orientation of a particular area. The pattern of his absences from the staff table, which she had tracked and which clustered around specific phases of the calendar, and his habit of lurking near the third-floor corridor. "These are careful observations, Miss Granger," Dumbledore said. "I also looked into his record," Hermione said. "He spent the year before this one in Albania. There are accounts in the library archives of strange disappearances and animal deaths in Albanian forests in the last few years, patterns that align with the parasitic presence feeding on local wildlife." She paused. "I don't know what's behind his turban, but I think whatever happened to him in Albania is still with him. And I think it's interested in what's hidden on the third floor." The silence in the office lasted 7 seconds, long enough that Fawkes shuffled on his perch. "What is behind his turban?" Dumbledore asked very quietly. "I don't know," Hermione said, which was a lie so precise it was essentially true. She was 11 years old and had found this through library research, not through future knowledge, and she couldn't claim to know the specific form of what was there. "But I think it's something dark. Something that came back from Albania with him." Dumbledore looked at her for a very long time. She held his gaze steadily and let him see what she wanted him to see. A brilliant, methodical first year who had a demonstrated track record of noticing what others missed, presenting a carefully evidenced concern to the appropriate authority. "You are not what I expected, Hermione Granger," Dumbledore said finally. "I read a lot," she said. Ron had laughed the first time she'd used that line. Dumbledore almost smiled. "I will look into Professor Quirrell's situation personally," Dumbledore said. "I ask that you continue to say nothing of this to anyone, and that you keep yourself away from the third-floor corridor." "Of course, Professor." And Hermione. She was at the door. "You have done this school, and Harry Potter, and Sirius Black, an extraordinary service this term. I want you to know that." "Thank you, Professor," she said. "There's one more thing I'd like to discuss with you. When you've dealt with Professor Quirrell, something more complex." "More complex than Peter Pettigrew?" "Significantly more complex," she said, "but not urgent in the same way. It can wait until after Christmas." She left him with that. The strategic placement of that final statement was deliberate. She was giving Dumbledore time to deal with Quirrell, to process the implications of what he found, and to arrive at their next conversation with his mind already oriented toward dark magic of an extraordinary nature. She was priming the conversation she needed to have, and she was establishing the pattern that would govern their relationship. She brought him complete, evidenced intelligence, and he acted on it. Christmas. Quirrell neutralized. Dumbledore moved on Quirrell before the Christmas break. The specific mechanism was not publicly announced, but the outcome was visible. Professor Quirrell was absent from the last week of term for health reasons. He did not return after Christmas. The defense against the dark arts position was filled in January by a qualified substitute with a clean record. Hermione learned the details and fragments from reliable sources. An overheard conversation between McGonagall and Flitwick in the corridor outside the library, and one sentence from Dumbledore when she returned for the spring term. "The matter with Professor Quirrell has been resolved," he said. "The entity that was using him has been dispersed." Voldemort's spirit, barely coherent, had fled Quirrell's dying body and screamed back toward the Albanian forests it had come from. Weaker than ever, without a body, without a servant, without a Horcrux network that Hermione had not yet begun dismantling, but without the specific threat of the Philosopher's Stone because Dumbledore had removed the stone from Hogwarts entirely once he understood what was happening. Nicholas Flamel had been informed. The stone had been returned. The third-floor corridor was unsealed, and Lord Voldemort's wraith was in Albania. Alone. Confused. Without a single active servant in the British wizarding world, because Pettigrew was the only one who'd been looking for him, and Pettigrew was in ministry custody. It was November, and Hermione was 11 years old, and already the original timeline had fractured so completely that the war she remembered might never happen at all. She allowed herself exactly one evening of relief. She sat in the Gryffindor common room by the fire, with Harry and Ron on either side of her, doing absolutely nothing productive, and she thought about everyone who was still alive. Then she thought about the scar on Harry's forehead. The one thing she hadn't solved yet, the one anchor that connected Voldemort to continued existence even as a wraith, the one problem that didn't have an answer yet. One evening of relief, then back to work. January 1992, the Horcrux briefing. She requested a meeting with Dumbledore in the second week of January, framing it as a follow-up to their earlier conversation. She said she had information about the nature of Voldemort's immortality that she believed he needed to have. Dumbledore received her on a Thursday evening, with Fawkes on his perch, and a fire burning, and the quiet attention of someone who had spent 30 years waiting for someone to tell him something he didn't already know. Hermione sat across from him, folded her hands on her knees, and said, "I believe Voldemort created multiple soul anchors to prevent his own death. I believe these are the reason he survived the Killing Curse's rebound in 1981, and I believe I know where most of them are." The silence that followed was the longest Hermione had ever sat through in this office. "Soul anchors," Dumbledore said finally, very carefully. "The technical term, I believe, is Horcrux," Hermione said. "A dark object into which a fragment of the soul is placed, requiring first the commission of murder to split the soul through the act of ultimate evil. As long as the Horcrux survives, the Maker cannot die." Dumbledore's face had undergone a series of changes she found impossible to catalog precisely. Shock, recognition, confirmation of a theory held for years without proof, and something that might have been relief at no longer being alone with the suspicion. "Where did you find this information?" he asked. "I've been reading very broadly," she said, which was entirely accurate. She had read everything about Horcruxes in the original timeline, had helped Harry build his understanding from first principles during the months of hunting. There are references in the library's restricted section that I accessed through Professor McGonagall's permission slip. She'd been given a general restricted section permission slip in November, after the Pettigrew credibility establishment, and had used it to develop her cover story. The pieces pointed to a coherent theory. "And the locations," Dumbledore said. "You said you know where most of them are. Based on Voldemort's known history and the objects he would have had access to." This framing was critical. She was presenting her future knowledge as historical analysis, inferring from patterns rather than claiming certainty. "I believe he would have chosen objects of historical significance, things that meant something, trophies, artifacts, and locations tied to his personal history." She laid it out. Not in the clinical certainty of someone who'd actually hunted them, but in the careful hedged language of someone who'd constructed a theory from historical research. Tom Riddle's diary. She'd seen references in library texts to dark objects capable of memory preservation and personality imprinting. A diary was a logical choice for someone who had grown up in isolation and valued the permanence of the written word. She believed Lucius Malfoy might have it based on his proximity to Voldemort during the First War and the timing of certain events she'd researched. Marvolo Gaunt's ring, The Gaunt family shack in Little Hangleton was Voldemort's maternal heritage, a location of personal significance he would have visited. The ring was described in historical accounts of the Gaunt family as a family heirloom. Salazar Slytherin's locket. She had read about Regulus Black's disappearance in 1979, and the subsequent account, pieced together from family records that pointed toward an attempted Horcrux theft. The locket was almost certainly at 12 Grimmauld Place, with the house elf creature. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, lost for centuries, but located according to Helena Ravenclaw's ghost in the Room of Requirement at Hogwarts. She had spoken with Helena during November and been told the story. Helga Hufflepuff's cup, in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts, based on the known inventory of Bellatrix Lestrange's vault contents as documented in records she'd accessed through the library. And Harry Potter's scar. She paused here. Dumbledore was watching her with an intensity that was unlike anything she'd seen from him before. He wasn't using legilimency. He was simply listening, with his complete and undivided attention, in the way of someone who had just had the most important intelligence of the century laid on his desk by an 11-year-old girl. The scar, he said, very quietly. I believe the killing curse's rebound in 1981 accidentally created a seventh Horcrux inside Harry Potter's scar, Hermione said. I believe this is why he survived. The soul fragment attached to the nearest living thing when the curse rebounded, which was Harry, and that fragment has been inside him ever since. You understand what that would mean, Dumbledore said, for Harry. Yes, Hermione said. I understand exactly what it would mean, and I want to be very clear about one thing, Professor. She held his gaze directly. I will not accept that Harry has to die to resolve this problem. I don't care what the conventional understanding of Horcrux destruction requires. There has to be another way, and I would like your help finding it. The fire crackled. Fawkes made a low sound from his perch. Dumbledore looked at the 11-year-old girl across his desk, who had just disassembled his entire strategic understanding of the war with Voldemort, and replaced it with something simultaneously better and more devastating. How did you come to know all of this? Dumbledore asked, and this time the question was not casual. It was not rhetorical. It was the real question, the one he'd been building to for the entire conversation. I read very broadly, Hermione said, and this time the line didn't work the way it had before. They both knew it. Miss Granger, Dumbledore said, I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to understand that I will not be alarmed by the honest answer. In fact, I suspect the honest answer will explain a great deal. He paused. Are you operating on information that could not have been obtained through any library in Britain? The fire crackled. Hermione held very still. This was the moment she had planned for and feared in equal measure. Dumbledore was too intelligent, too experienced, too perceptive. She had known since the sorting that he would reach this question eventually. She had hoped to delay it further, had hoped to establish more of the Horcrux operation before having to explain herself. But he was here. The question was asked, and lying to Albus Dumbledore was not a viable long-term strategy. Yes, she said. Would you be willing to tell me how? She had 3 prepared responses for this moment. The first was complete denial, which she had already ruled out. The second was partial truth, a version that gestured at time travel without specifics, that implied accident rather than intention. The third was complete honesty. She chose the third. I am 19 years old, she said. Mentally, I have the memories and experience of a woman who lived through the next 7 years of wizarding history, including a war that resulted in the deaths of over 50 people I knew personally. I don't know the mechanism of how I came to be in this body at this time, but I am here, and I have complete knowledge of what happens if nothing changes, and I have been using that knowledge to prevent it. The silence was very long. The diary, Dumbledore said. The ring, the locket, Pettigrew, Quirrell. Yes, you knew all of it. Yes. And the scar. Yes. Her voice was steady. I knew about the scar in the original timeline. And I know how it was resolved in the original timeline. But that resolution required Voldemort to resurrect himself, using Harry's blood in a ritual that has not happened, and, if everything goes correctly, never will happen. Without that ritual, the mechanism that allowed Harry to survive doesn't exist. Which is why we need to find another way. Dumbledore stood up slowly and walked to the window. He stood there for almost a full minute, looking out at the dark grounds. When he turned back, his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. You have been carrying this alone since September, he said. Yes. You are 11 years old. Mentally, I'm 19. And I've had 7 years to develop my tolerance for carrying difficult information alone. That, Dumbledore said with something in his voice she hadn't expected. Something like sorrow is not a skill anyone should need to develop. He came back to the desk and sat down. I owe you an apology, Hermione, and I believe I owe you a great deal more than that. He folded his hands. In the future, you remember. You said I was planning to let Harry die. You knew about the scar Horcrux, she said. You planned to keep it secret from Harry until the appropriate moment. You orchestrated events so that Harry would choose to walk into death on his own, without understanding whether he would survive. It was the most calculated act of manipulation I have ever seen from someone who genuinely loved the person they were manipulating. The silence was different this time. Not shocked. Confronted. I am willing to believe, Dumbledore said slowly, that in a different version of circumstances I made choices I would deeply regret. I have made such choices before. He met her eyes. I will not make them with you watching. Good, Hermione said. Then let's find another way to save Harry. Together. February-June 1992. The beginning of the hunt. The partnership between Hermione Granger and Albus Dumbledore, forged in January 1992, was unlike any relationship that had existed in the wizarding world in living memory. Dumbledore provided institutional power, magical supremacy, and 6 decades of accumulated knowledge and political connections. Hermione provided perfect intelligence, a complete strategic map of Voldemort's Horcrux architecture, and an uncompromising moral framework that refused to accept the acceptable losses that Dumbledore had spent years learning to live with. The tension between these contributions was productive rather than destructive. She pushed him towards solutions he'd dismissed as impossible. He provided the magical resources and authority to attempt them. They began with the objects she'd identified, working through the accessible ones first. Slytherin's locket came first, because Sirius's freedom had made it straightforward. In February, Dumbledore approached Sirius, who was still recovering from Azkaban at a supervised magical facility, and explained what was needed. Sirius, who had hated Kreacher and 12 Grimmauld Place in equal measure, but who was motivated by the knowledge that Regulus had died trying to destroy one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, gave the order. Kreacher was summoned. He arrived resentful and resistant, clutching the memory of his last master's last command. But Sirius had something now that he hadn't had in the original timeline, the full truth about Regulus, provided by Hermione through Dumbledore. The knowledge that Regulus had died not as a coward but as someone who had tried, at the cost of his life, to end Voldemort. Hermione had written out everything she knew about Regulus Black's final months, and given it to Dumbledore to pass to Sirius. Sirius told Kreacher. The old house elf, hearing his beloved master Regulus's sacrifice described with the specificity of truth, broke in a way that was not destructive, but releasing. He brought the locket. He explained where Regulus had found it. He explained what Regulus had asked him to do. Completing Regulus Black's final mission transformed Kreacher. This was something Hermione had always known was possible, had seen it happen in the original timeline when Harry treated the elf with basic kindness. It happened here earlier and more completely, with the truth of Regulus's heroism as the mechanism. The locket was delivered to Dumbledore, destroyed with basilisk venom harvested from the Chamber of Secrets. Dumbledore had organized a careful retrieval operation, accessing the chamber through Parseltongue recordings provided by researchers, collecting venom from the living basilisk, with precautions that prevented casualties. The Ravenclaw diadem came in March. Dumbledore accessed the Room of Requirement on the 7th floor, found the Room of Hidden Things exactly as Hermione had described it, and located the diadem among centuries of accumulated junk, destroyed with basilisk venom. The gaunt ring was April. Dumbledore traveled to Little Hangleton with extensive precautions. He retrieved the ring. He did not put it on because Hermione had told him what would happen if he did. The stone in the ring is the Resurrection Stone, she had told him, in the January meeting. One of the 3 Deathly Hallows. It can show the shades of the dead. You will want to put it on. You'll want to see Ariana. She had said this as gently as she knew how. If you put it on, you will die. The Gaunt Ring carries a withering curse that the Resurrection Stone's housing activates. In the original timeline, you had a year to live from the moment you put it on. I don't want that for you. Dumbledore had been very still when she'd said this. The mention of Ariana, his sister dead at 14 by a curse that might have been his own, the grief he had carried for 60 years, landed exactly as hard as she had known it would. You know about Ariana, he said. I know enough, she said. I know you've carried it. And I know that the stone would offer you something that looks like her, and is not. He had not spoken for a long time. In April, he returned from Little Hangleton, with the ring's Horcrux destroyed and the stone intact, having not worn it. The diary was the hardest of the spring operations, because it required moving against Lucius Malfoy, who had not yet deployed it, and who would not do so until August 1992. We need it before he uses it, Hermione told Dumbledore. In the original timeline, he gave it to Ginny Weasley, and it nearly killed her. It possessed her. It used her as a vessel to open the Chamber of Secrets. Several students were petrified. Harry had to kill the basilisk in second year. She paused. I would prefer to avoid all of that. You're suggesting we retrieve the diary from Malfoy Manor before it can be deployed, Dumbledore said. I'm suggesting that a legal search of Malfoy property for dark artifacts, triggered by Pettigrew's testimony under Veritaserum, in which he named Lucius Malfoy as a Death Eater supporter, would give the Ministry authority to conduct exactly that search. Dumbledore considered this. You have thought about this carefully. The Ministry's search of Malfoy Manor happened in May 1992, authorized by the Minister on the basis of Pettigrew's Veritaserum testimony. Lucius claimed Imperius, as he always did. Several dark objects were confiscated. Among them was a small black diary, Tom Riddle, 1943, embossed on the cover. It was delivered to Dumbledore by Ministry confiscation order, destroyed with basilisk venom that same afternoon. By June 1992, the end of Hermione's first year at Hogwarts, 4 Horcruxes had been destroyed: the locket, the diadem, the ring, and the diary. The cup remained in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts, requiring a more complex approach. And Harry's scar remained unsolved, the problem she and Dumbledore had begun working on in every meeting, approaching from new angles, neither of them willing to stop until they found a path that didn't require a boy to die. Voldemort's wraith was in Albania, alone, without a single Horcrux outside Harry's scar and a cup behind Goblin security she hadn't breached yet. Hermione sat on the Hogwarts Express going south at the end of term, watching the Scottish Highlands give way to softer countryside, and thought about what she'd accomplished. Pettigrew exposed, Sirius free, Quirrell neutralized, 4 Horcruxes destroyed, Dumbledore alive and fully informed, no ring on his hand, no countdown running. Harry spending his first Christmas with a godfather who loved him rather than in a cupboard under the stairs. She thought about Fred Weasley, who was somewhere on this train right now, laughing about something with his twin. She thought about Remus Lupin, who was no longer isolated. Sirius's freedom had brought Remus back into the orbit of people who loved him. She thought about Dobby, who she'd been unable to help yet because the diary interception had removed the mechanism of his canon freeing, and who needed a different path to freedom that she hadn't worked out yet. She thought about Harry's scar, and the problem she and Dumbledore hadn't solved, and the wraith in Albania getting weaker every day without a body or a Horcrux to sustain it. She took out her original piece of parchment, the must-save registry she'd written on the train on September 1st, and looked at the names. Sirius Black, alive and free. Remus Lupin, alive. Dobby, still enslaved, still working on it. Cedric Diggory, alive, and if Voldemort never returned to a body, would stay that way. She folded the parchment and put it in her pocket. The train moved south through the summer landscape, and Hermione pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and let herself, just for a moment, feel the particular weight of being the only person alive who knew what all of this had cost the first time around. Summer 1992, the Gringotts problem. The Hufflepuff Cup sat in Bellatrix Lestrange's vault at Gringotts Bank, protected by goblin wards, the thief's downfall that stripped enchantments and disguises. Gemino and Flagrante curses that multiplied and heated any object touched, without authorization, and a half-mad dragon chained in the depths of the oldest tunnels. In the original timeline, Hermione, Harry, and Ron had broken in during wartime using Polyjuice Potion, Imperious Curses, and Desperation. They'd escaped on the dragon's back, destroying half the bank in the process, and permanently burning bridges with the Goblin Nation. It had been necessary in war. In peacetime, it would be catastrophic. Hermione explained this to Dumbledore in their first meeting after term ended, sitting in his Hogwarts office with the summer sunlight streaming through tower windows. We need the cup, she said. But a break-in would create political consequences we can't afford. The goblins would view it as an act of war against their sovereignty. Even if we succeeded, We destroy any future cooperation between wizards and goblins at exactly the moment we need that cooperation most. You have an alternative approach, Dumbledore said. It wasn't a question. Bill Weasley, Hermione said. He's a curse breaker for Gringotts. He has goblin trust. And more importantly, we have legal leverage. Bellatrix Lestrange is a convicted Death Eater serving a life sentence in Azkaban. Her vault contains dark artifacts. We know this because Pettigrew's Veritaserum testimony referenced Voldemort storing important objects with his most trusted followers. The Ministry has authority to seize dark artifacts from the vaults of imprisoned Death Eaters. The goblins would resist Ministry seizure, Dumbledore said. Gringotts has maintained independence from Ministry authority for centuries, which is why we don't seize it, Hermione said. We negotiate. The goblins don't want dark artifacts in their bank. Those objects are dangerous, potentially explosive, liability rather than asset. We offer them a deal. The Ministry formally requests goblin cooperation in identifying and removing dark artifacts from Death Eater vaults, with full goblin oversight of the process. The goblins maintain their sovereignty. The Ministry gets access to the cup. Everyone wins. Except Bellatrix Lestrange, Dumbledore observed. She's in Azkaban for life. I'm not concerned about her property rights. Dumbledore's expression was complicated, something between approval and discomfort at the clinical precision with which she'd mapped the operation. You've thought about this in considerable detail. I know it works. I just need your help making the political connections. The operation took 2 months to arrange. Dumbledore approached the Ministry through proper channels, framing it as a cooperative effort between the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and Gringotts to identify dangerous dark artifacts that posed risks to bank security. Minister Fudge, who had learned to trust Dumbledore's counsel after the Sirius Black exoneration, agreed to the framework. The goblins negotiated hard. They wanted full control over which vaults were searched, wanted wizarding oversight minimized, and wanted formal acknowledgement that this was cooperative rather than compulsory. Dumbledore, working with Arthur Weasley from the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office, structured the agreement to give the goblins everything they wanted in exchange for access to 3 specific vaults, including Lestrange's. Bill Weasley was assigned as the cursebreaker on the operation. The search happened in August, with Bill working alongside goblin cursebreakers and Ministry observers. The cup was identified among Bellatrix's possessions, removed under controlled conditions, and delivered to Dumbledore's custody within 24 hours. Destroyed with basilisk venom that same evening. 5 Horcruxes destroyed. Only the scar remained. Year 2, the year without crisis. Hermione's second year at Hogwarts was, in the most surreal way possible, ordinary. There was no diary possessing Ginny Weasley, because the diary had been destroyed before it could be deployed. There was no basilisk terrorizing the school, because the Chamber of Secrets remained sealed and the basilisk slept undisturbed. There was no series of petrifications, no messages written in blood on corridor walls, no widespread fear that the heir of Slytherin had returned. The defense against the dark arts position was filled by a competent substitute teacher who taught actual defensive magic rather than memory charms and self-promotion. Gilderoy Lockhart never came to Hogwarts at all. He was still traveling and fabricating his adventures elsewhere, never getting the professorial appointment that would have exposed his fraud. For the first time since arriving in 1991, Hermione attended classes where she didn't already know every crisis that would unfold. She did homework. She studied for exams. She spent time in the library researching the scar problem with the focused intensity of someone who knew this was the only thing that mattered. Harry spent Christmas with Sirius at a small cottage in the countryside that Sirius had purchased after his release. He came back to Hogwarts in January with the specific glow of a child who had experienced for the first time what it felt like to be someone's first priority. He told Hermione and Ron about it in fragments, Sirius teaching him to fly properly, cooking meals together, long conversations about James and Lily that Harry had never been able to have with anyone else. "He's teaching me about my family," Harry said one evening in the common room, his voice quiet with something like wonder. "He knew my dad. He has stories." Hermione watched him and thought about the alternative timeline, where Sirius had spent another year in Azkaban and wouldn't be free until the end of 3rd year, where Harry's only connection to his parents had been through fragments and half-told stories from people who felt guilty about surviving. "I'm glad," she said, and meant it completely. Ron's 2nd year was also different. Without the diary crisis, Ginny didn't suffer the trauma of possession and near death. She was a normal first year, nervous, enthusiastic, occasionally sending Ron letters asking him to stop embarrassing her in front of his friends. Ron complained about this constantly, but with the particular exasperation of someone who is genuinely fond of his sister, rather than terrified for her life. The year proceeded. Hermione scored top marks in every exam. Harry made the Gryffindor Quidditch team properly, and won matches without nearly dying. Ron developed a devastating strategic sense at Wizard's chess that occasionally made Hermione wonder if he should be helping with operational planning. And through it all, Hermione and Dumbledore met every 2 weeks to discuss the problem they couldn't solve. The scar, 18 months of research. The problem was deceptively simple to state and devastatingly complex to solve. How do you destroy a Horcrux that's embedded in a living human being without killing the human? Every conventional Horcrux destruction method required destroying the container beyond magical repair. Basilisk venom dissolved objects at the molecular level. Fiend fire incinerated them to ash. The sword of Gryffindor, imbued with basilisk venom, required driving the blade through the container. These methods worked perfectly for objects. For a living host, they meant death. The mechanism that had worked in the original timeline, Voldemort casting the killing curse at Harry in the Forbidden Forest, had required 3 conditions that would not exist in this timeline. The blood tether from Voldemort's resurrection using Harry's blood, Harry's willing sacrifice invoking ancient protective magic, and the Elder Wand's refusal to kill its true master. Without Voldemort's resurrection, the blood tether would never form. The mechanism that had allowed Harry to survive didn't exist. Hermione and Dumbledore approached the problem from every angle. Magical theory approach. Dumbledore consulted every text on soul magic in the Hogwarts library, including several in his private collection, that predated the school itself. The consistent conclusion was that soul fragments attached to living hosts could not be separated without killing the host. The soul and the body were too fundamentally intertwined. Healing magic approach. Madame Pomfrey was consulted discreetly, without revealing the full context. Her expertise in magical healing was unmatched, but her assessment was grim. If a foreign magical entity is embedded in the scar tissue at the soul level, removing it would be akin to removing a piece of the patient's own soul. I don't have the knowledge or tools for that kind of work. Charms approach. Professor Flitwick, brought into the conversation in December of second year after careful vetting, offered a different perspective. His half-goblin heritage gave him access to magical traditions that pure wizarding magic didn't encompass. Goblin magic focuses on the properties of objects and their relationships to owners, he explained. A Horcrux is an object, or a pseudo-object in this case, with a specific relationship to its creator. If we could sever that relationship rather than destroying the container, we might have a path. This was the first genuinely new idea they'd encountered. Flitwick worked with Dumbledore through the spring of second year, developing a theoretical framework for a severance charm, a piece of magic that would cut the connection between Voldemort's soul fragment and Harry's living soul without damaging Harry himself. The theory was elegant, the execution was unproven. Potions approach. In September of third year, Dumbledore made the decision to bring Severus Snape into the conversation. Snape had been tangentially aware of the Horcrux hunt. Dumbledore had consulted him on several occasions for his expertise in dark arts, but had not been told about the scar specifically. Bringing him in required revealing Harry's situation completely. The conversation happened in Dumbledore's office on a Thursday evening, with Hermione present at her own insistence. "You're telling me," Snape said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that the boy has been carrying a piece of the Dark Lord's soul in his head for 12 years. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "And you knew this?" "I suspected." Miss Granger confirmed it. Snape's eyes snapped to Hermione. "How exactly did you confirm something that the most powerful wizards alive have been unable to verify?" "I read very broadly," Hermione said, which by this point had become almost a joke between her and Dumbledore. Snape did not find it amusing. "This is not a matter for levity," Snape said. "If what you're telling me is accurate, the boy is a ticking time bomb. The connection between him and the Dark Lord. That's why you're here. We need your help developing a method." Snape looked at her with the particular intensity of someone who was rapidly recalibrating his understanding of a person. He'd been teaching her for 2 years. She was the top student in every class, brilliant to the point that it sometimes seemed performative, and had personally been responsible for freeing Sirius Black and exposing Pettigrew. He had respected her in the abstract. He was beginning to realize that respect was insufficient. "What do you have so far?" Snape asked. They laid it out. Flitwick's severance charm theory, Pomfrey's assessment of the medical constraints, The complete lack of historical precedent for anything like this working. Snape listened. Then he said, "A potion." Dumbledore said, "Not the right kind." Snape stood and began pacing, the way he did when his mind was working faster than his body could remain still. The draught of living death induces a death-like state. It's used for cases where the patient needs to be suspended while healing occurs, but there's a variant, theoretical, never successfully brewed, that targets the soul rather than the body. The soul sleep draught, Dumbledore said slowly. Exactly. It was theorized by Paracelsus in the 16th century. The idea was to create a state where the soul and body temporarily separate without severing the connection entirely, a controlled, reversible death. The soul remains tethered to the body, but exists in a liminal space. In that space, a foreign soul fragment seeking life might be drawn out, separated, vulnerable to destruction. Might, Hermione repeated. There are no certainties in magic this complex, Snape said sharply. But it's the closest thing to a viable path I've heard in this conversation. If the potion induces temporary separation, and we combine it with Flitwick's severance charm, Dumbledore was following the logic now. We could create a window, a moment where the Horcrux is exposed and vulnerable while Harry's soul is protected by the body's continuing life. And then? Hermione asked. Then, Snape said, we destroy it with basilisk venom while the subject is in the suspended state, and we use phoenix tears to prevent the venom from killing the host. The tears counteract the venom's lethality, while allowing it to destroy the foreign soul fragment. It's theoretical, Flitwick said. He'd been silent through most of this, listening. We'd be combining 4 separate types of magic that have never been used in concert. Soul magic, goblin charm work, potion-induced stasis, and phoenix healing. The margin for error is unacceptable, Hermione finished. Which is why we test it. Extensively, on non-living subjects first, then on volunteers with controlled conditions, and only when we're absolutely certain it works do we attempt it on Harry. Harry will consent, Hermione said. He'd consent right now if we told him. But I'm not asking him to consent to an experimental procedure until we're certain it won't kill him. The room was silent. When did you become the one making these decisions? Snape asked, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite hostility, something closer to grudging respect. When I was the only person in the room who'd already watched him die once, Hermione said quietly. I'm not watching it happen again. Year 3, testing and refinement. 3rd year proceeded around the edges of the SCAR project. In the foreground were classes, exams, Hogsmeade visits, and the specific dramas of 13-year-old social dynamics. In the background, in Dumbledore's office and in Snape's private laboratory, 4 of the most brilliant magical minds in Britain worked on solving a problem that had never been solved before. Snape spent 6 months developing the soul sleep draught, working from Paracelsus's theoretical notes and adapting them with his own expertise. The first 17 attempts failed. The potion either did nothing or induced a coma from which the test subject, a mouse, could not be revived. The 18th attempt produced a state that resembled what they needed. The mouse's body remained alive, breathing slowed but steady, while magical scans showed a temporary loosening of the soul's attachment to the physical form. Flitwick refined the severance charm through the same period, testing on objects first. Could he sever the connection between a Horcrux and its creator without destroying the object itself? The answer, after months of work, was yes. A careful, precisely targeted charm could cut the tether while leaving both container and fragment intact. Dumbledore coordinated between them, providing resources and magical theory from his 6 decades of accumulated knowledge. And Hermione read everything, questioned everything, and refused to accept any version of the plan that had more than a 5% failure rate. By March of 3rd year, they had a protocol. By May, they had tested it successfully on a constructed Horcrux, a small object deliberately imbued with a fragment of soul, donated by a volunteer from the Department of Mysteries who was terminally ill and wished to contribute to magical research. The object was placed in the soul sleep state. The severance charm was applied, the fragment was destroyed with basilisk venom, and the container survived intact. The protocol worked. In June of 3rd year, at the end of exams, Hermione and Dumbledore sat Harry down and explained everything. The conversation Harry deserves. They met in Dumbledore's office on a Thursday evening. Harry arrived confused about why he'd been summoned, accompanied by Hermione, who he'd learned over 2 years to trust completely. Dumbledore did not start with small talk. Harry, we need to tell you something about the night your parents died. And about the scar on your forehead. What followed was the most honest conversation Harry Potter had ever had with an adult in a position of authority. Dumbledore explained Horcruxes, explained what Voldemort had done to anchor himself to life through murder and soul-splitting, explained that the night the killing curse rebounded, a fragment of Voldemort's soul had attached itself to the nearest living thing, a 1-year-old boy in a cot. Harry listened with the stillness of someone processing information that fundamentally changed his understanding of himself. "There's a piece of Voldemort inside me," he said finally. "In my scar." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "That's why I can speak Parseltongue. Why I have the dreams. Why I feel—" He stopped. "A connection to him," Hermione said gently. "Yes. The soul fragment creates a link. It's not you, Harry. It's the thing inside you. You are not Voldemort. And you never were." Harry looked at her. "How long have you known?" "Since the beginning," Hermione said. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. We needed to be sure we could fix it before we told you it existed. Can you fix it?" Harry's voice was very quiet. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "We have a procedure. It's been tested extensively. There are risks, but we believe they're manageable. If you consent to undergo it, we can remove the Horcrux without harming you." Whenever you're ready," Dumbledore said. "This is your choice, Harry. We won't proceed without your informed, willing consent." This was the critical difference from the original timeline. In that version, Harry had learned about the Horcrux in his final year, in the middle of a war, with no time for processing and no choice except to walk into the forest and die. Here, he was 13. He was surrounded by people who loved him, and he was being asked rather than manipulated. "What happens if I say no?" Harry asked. "Then we wait," Hermione said. "We keep researching. We find another way. Or we wait until you're ready. This is not time-sensitive in the way that matters most. Voldemort is a wraith in Albania with no Horcruxes except yours. He's getting weaker, not stronger. We have time." "But you want to do it," Harry said. "I want you free of this thing," Hermione said. "But I want you alive more. And I want it to be your choice." Harry was quiet for a long time. "Then, if it works, if you remove it, I won't have the connection anymore. I won't speak Parseltongue. I won't have the dreams." "Correct," Dumbledore said. "And Voldemort will have one less anchor to life." "Also correct." "Then I want to do it," Harry said. "Not because I'm being noble, because I don't want this thing inside me, and because I trust you." He looked at Hermione. "Both of you. Are you sure?" Hermione asked. "I'm sure," Harry said. "When do we start?" "The hospital wing, the procedure. They scheduled it for the first week of summer, after term ended but while the castle's resources were still available. Harry wanted Ron there." Hermione agreed without hesitation. Sirius was contacted and arrived at Hogwarts the day before. The procedure took place in the hospital wing, with Madame Pomfrey overseeing Harry's vital signs, Dumbledore providing magical containment, Snape administering the soul sleep draught, Flitwick ready with the severance charm, and Hermione holding Harry's hand because she'd promised him she would. Ron sat on Harry's other side. Sirius stood at the foot of the bed, his hands gripping the footboard with the tension of someone who had already lost too much and was terrified of losing more. "This is going to be fine," Hermione told Harry, for the 4th time that morning. "You've said that," Harry observed. "I'm reminding myself as much as you." Harry's smile was brief but real. "Hermione, I trust you. If you say it's going to work, I believe you." She had to look away for a moment because the weight of that trust was almost unbearable. Snape approached with the potion. "This will induce a state similar to deep sleep. You'll be unconscious but alive. Your breathing will slow, your heartbeat will slow. It will feel like falling. Don't fight it." "How long will I be under?" Harry asked. 20 minutes, if everything goes as planned," Snape said. "Longer if complications arise. But we'll be monitoring constantly. See you on the other side." "See you," she said, and her voice almost held. He drank the potion. The effect was rapid. His eyes glazed, his breathing deepened, and within 30 seconds he was in the suspended state, his body alive but his consciousness somewhere else entirely. Madame Pomfrey monitored his vital signs with clinical precision. Heartbeat steady, respiration steady, magical signature stable. Dumbledore cast the containment charm, a sphere of golden light that surrounded Harry's head, isolating the scar. "I have the area contained. Phileas, whenever you're ready." Flitwick stepped forward, wand raised, and began the severance charm. It was not a single incantation, but a series of them, each building on the last, each designed to cut a different layer of the connection between the Horcrux and its host. Hermione watched the scar. For the first minute, nothing visible happened. Then, slowly, the tissue around the lightning bolt began to darken. Not with blood, but with something else. Something that looked like smoke trapped under skin. "It's working," Flitwick said quietly. "I can feel the tether separating. Severus, stand ready." Snape had the sword of Gryffindor in his hands, its blade still carrying the basilisk venom from the chamber retrieval 2 years earlier. He stood beside the bed, waiting. The scar split. Not physically, the skin remained intact, but magically, something dark and formless began to writhe free, pulling itself out of Harry's forehead with the desperation of a parasite that knew it was being evicted. Dumbledore's containment held it, trapped it in the golden sphere, where it couldn't flee back into Harry or escape into the room. "Now," Dumbledore said. Snape drove the sword through the containment field, through the dark writhing fragment, and the thing that had been part of Tom Riddle's soul screamed. It was not a sound that should have been possible. A scream without a mouth, transmitted directly into the minds of everyone present. Hermione had heard it before, in the Horcrux locket when they destroyed it in a frozen forest. She gritted her teeth and held Harry's hand, and did not let go. The fragment blackened, dissolved, ceased to exist. Fawkes was there instantly, his tears falling onto Harry's scar where the sword had struck. The Phoenix tears neutralized the venom, healed the microscopic damage, sealed the wound that had existed for 12 years. The scar faded from angry red to pale white, to almost invisible. Madame Pomfrey checked vital signs. Heartbeat normalizing, respiration normalizing. No adverse reactions detected. Snape administered the counteragent to the soul sleep draught. He should wake in 30 seconds to 2 minutes. They waited. Hermione counted her own heartbeat and tried not to think about the alternative timeline where this procedure hadn't existed, where Harry had walked into a forest to die and she'd been able to do nothing except watch from a distance. Harry's eyes opened. He blinked at the ceiling, disoriented. Then he looked at Hermione. "Did it work?" "It worked," she said, and her voice broke completely. "It's gone. You're free." Harry raised his hand to his forehead, touching the place where the scar had been. His fingers found smooth skin, no raised tissue, no lightning bolt mark. "I can't feel it anymore," he said, wonder in his voice. "The connection, the weight, it's just gone." Ron was staring like he'd just watched a miracle. Dumbledore had the expression of a man who had spent 12 years carrying guilt and had just been offered absolution. Hermione held Harry's hand and said, "Welcome back. Albania, ending the Wraith. With the final Horcrux destroyed, Lord Voldemort's immortality infrastructure was completely dismantled. 7 Horcruxes had existed. 7 were destroyed. The Wraith in Albania was no longer anchored to existence by anything except its own will and the residual dark magic that had sustained it for 13 years. That was not, however, enough. A Wraith without Horcruxes would eventually fade, but eventually could mean decades. And while the Wraith persisted, it could possess animals, could seek out dark wizards who might help it, could remain a threat. Dumbledore organized the hunt in August 1994, with full support from the International Confederation of Wizards. The Albanian Ministry of Magic cooperated. Dumbledore's reputation as supreme mugwump opened doors that no one else could have opened. The expedition team was small and expert. Dumbledore himself wielding the Elder Wand, Moody, freshly recruited to help with threat detection, a team of Albanian aurors who knew the forests, and at her own insistence, Hermione. "You're 14, Dumbledore had said when she demanded to be included. "I'm 19, mentally," she'd said, "and I've faced him before. I know what he is. Let me finish this." Dumbledore had looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well." They found the Wraith in late August, in the same region where Voldemort had hidden after the diadem theft, a stretch of dark forest where local magical creatures avoided, and where the trees grew twisted. The Wraith was barely sentient, clinging to a host snake that was dying from the possession. Dumbledore's magic caught it before it could flee, contained it in a sphere of pure light that the Wraith could not penetrate. It screamed and thrashed and tried to break free, but the Elder Wand's power was absolute. They transported it, still contained, to the Department of Mysteries in London, where the Veil waited. The Veil was an ancient archway through which whispers came, voices of the dead calling to the living. It was a threshold to death, a one-way passage from which nothing returned. They brought the contained wraith to the veil chamber. Dumbledore, Hermione, and three unspeakables witnessed what happened next. Dumbledore released the containment directly above the veil. The wraith, without horcruxes to anchor it, without a body to sustain it, was drawn immediately toward the archway. It fought, screamed, tried to resist. It fell through. The whispers in the veil grew louder for a moment, then faded. The wraith was gone. The passage was one way. There was no return. Voldemort, the last fragment of Tom Riddle's fractured soul, ceased to exist. Not in a burst of green light, not in the theatrical defeat with witnesses and prophecies, in silence, in a basement, watched by 5 people, unmourned. Hermione stood beside the veil for a long time after, listening to the whispers fade, thinking about Fred Weasley and Remus Lupin and Dobby and all the people who had died the first time. She thought about Harry walking into a forest to die because it was the only way Dumbledore could see to end it. "It's over," Dumbledore said quietly beside her. "Yes," Hermione said. "It's over." September 1994, the year that should have been the Triwizard Tournament, 4th year started without a Triwizard Tournament, because Voldemort wasn't capable of orchestrating one. Barty Crouch Jr. remained under his father's imperious curse, never freed, never impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, never manipulating Harry's name into the Goblet of Fire. There was no tournament, no dragons, no lake task, no maze, no graveyard in Little Hangleton, where Cedric Diggory died saying, "Kill the spare." He played Quidditch, he went to Hogsmeade with Cho Chang, he lived a completely normal year and graduated in 1995 with honors and no trauma whatsoever. Harry spent 4th year actually being 14. He played Quidditch. He worried about exams. He went to Hogsmeade with his friends. Sirius visited every month, and they had dinner in Hogsmeade together, and Harry learned more stories about his parents. Ron developed a crush on a Ravenclaw girl and handled it with all the grace and subtlety of a 14-year-old boy, which was to say none. Hermione watched this unfold with the amused exasperation of someone who remembered the original timeline's Yule Ball disaster and was profoundly grateful that particular crisis didn't exist here. She spent 4th year reading, studying, and slowly allowing herself to believe that it had actually worked, that she had actually rewritten history, that the war she remembered was not going to happen. The lives she saved. By the end of 4th year, Hermione could count the confirmed saved lives. Sirius Black, alive and healthy and living in a cottage in the countryside. Harry's legal guardian, free to raise his godson, to teach him about James and Lily, to be the family Harry had never had. Remus Lupin, no longer isolated, reconnected with Sirius and with the knowledge that his friends hadn't betrayed each other. Employed at Hogwarts as the defense against the dark arts professor, starting in 3rd year, after Dumbledore offered him the position with full knowledge of his lycanthropy and full support. Teaching the job he was brilliant at, with students who respected him, without the trauma of thinking his best friend was a murderer. Fred Weasley, 18 years old in 1995, graduated from Hogwarts with George, opening a joke shop on Diagon Alley with Sirius's financial backing. Alive, laughing, whole. Dobby. This one had taken longer to solve. Without the diary scheme, Dobby hadn't been freed through Harry's sock trick. Hermione had needed to find another path. She'd eventually approached Sirius with a proposal. If Sirius, as a black family member, formally purchased Dobby from Lucius Malfoy, under the pretense of wanting a house elf with Malfoy training, he could then immediately free him. It had cost Sirius money he was happy to spend. Dobby had been freed in summer 1993. He now worked at Hogwarts by choice, paid 1 galleon a week, and tended the gardens with the devoted care of someone who had never expected to choose his own work. Cedric Diggory, alive and planning to become a healer, had never been in a graveyard, had never heard the words "kill the spare," would grow old. 50 others who had died in the Battle of Hogwarts. Colin Creevey graduated in 1990. Lavender Brown did not die to Fenrir Greyback. Tonks and Remus did not leave their son an orphan. They were both alive. Tonks working as an Auror, their son Teddy born in 1998 with his parents there to raise him. The war had not happened. The Battle of Hogwarts had not happened. The Great Hall had no bodies in it. Hermione kept a list, updating it every few months. Every name was a person she had watched die in the original timeline. Every name alive now was proof that it had worked. The cost she carries alone. Hermione Granger graduated from Hogwarts in 1998. top of her class, with Newt scores that made her eligible for any career she wanted. She could have joined the Department of Mysteries, could have become a professor, could have pursued any path in the wizarding world. She chose magical research, working with Dumbledore at Hogwarts on problems that had never been solved. She co-authored papers on Horcrux theory and soul magic, on the ethics of time and memory, on the question of whether changing the past created a new timeline or altered the original. She never told anyone, except Dumbledore, the complete truth. Harry knew she'd been instrumental in solving the Horcrux problem, but didn't know she'd lived the future. Ron thought she was simply brilliant. Sirius thought she was the cleverest witch he'd ever met. None of them knew that she was 19 when she arrived at Hogwarts, that she'd lived through a war and come back to prevent it. She was the only person alive who remembered the original timeline, the only one who knew what it had cost the first time, the only one who carried the grief of deaths that had never happened in this version of history. She sat in the Gryffindor common room sometimes, years after graduation, visiting Hogwarts in her capacity as a researcher. She'd watch students argue over homework, laugh at bad jokes, worry about Quidditch matches and exams and whether someone liked them back. Normal things, ordinary things, things that happened when there was no war. She thought about Fred Weasley laughing in a corridor that never collapsed, about Dobby tending roses in a garden he'd chosen to tend, about Harry growing up with a godfather who loved him instead of a cupboard under the stairs, about Cedric Diggory becoming a healer, about Remus and Tonks watching their son take his first steps. She thought about the alternative, the timeline she'd erased, the version where 50 people died in a single night and she'd had to step over bodies to find Harry in the wreckage. She carried that timeline like a scar no one else could see. That was the cost of rewriting history. She was the only one who knew what it cost to write it differently. She was the only one who remembered standing in a destroyed Great Hall with Fred's body cooling on the floor, with Remus and Tonks laid side by side, with Dobby buried under a headstone she'd helped carve. She remembered, and because she remembered, she could carry the weight of it, because every death she prevented was a death she'd already mourned. Every life she saved was a life she had already lost once. She was 26 years old the day she stood in a Hogwarts corridor and saw Fred and George Weasley, both of them, together, alive, arguing about a new product design. Fred said something that made George laugh so hard he nearly fell over, and Hermione had to excuse herself and find a bathroom where she could cry without anyone asking why. "Why are you crying?" George had asked, after she'd composed herself and come back out. "I'm just happy," she had said, which was true. "You're strange," George had said fondly, and gone back to arguing with Fred. Hermione watched them walk away together and thought, "You have no idea." Epilogue. 19 years later, September 1st, 2017, Platform 9 3/4 was crowded with families saying goodbye to students. Hermione stood beside the barrier with Ron. They'd married in 2005, a quieter ceremony than anyone expected, attended by close friends and featuring a best man speech from Harry that made half the guests cry. Their daughter Rose stood beside them, 11 years old, bushy-haired and brilliant, and so excited about Hogwarts that she'd been packed for 2 weeks. "Do you think I'll be in Gryffindor?" Rose asked for the 10th time that morning. "I think you'll be in whichever house suits you best," Hermione said, "and you'll be brilliant in any of them." Harry stood a few feet away with Ginny and their 3 children. Albus was starting Hogwarts this year too, nervous in the way that James had never been, worried about which house he'd be sorted into. Harry caught Hermione's eye and smiled. He was 37 now, with the lightning bolt scar that had faded to almost nothing after the hospital wing procedure in 1994. He had no connection to Voldemort, no nightmares from a foreign soul fragment, no weight of prophecy hanging over his head. He'd married Ginny Weasley, had become an Auror, had spent 20 years helping build a ministry that was better than the one they'd grown up with. He'd lived. Sirius was there too, 60 years old and gray-haired and alive. He'd been at Harry's wedding, had been there when each of Harry's children were born, had been the grandfather figure they'd all needed. He would grow old beside Remus, who taught at Hogwarts still, whose son Teddy had graduated 3 years earlier and was training to be an Auror like his godfather Harry. Fred and George Weasley ran their joke shop on Diagon Alley, both of them alive, both of them still finishing each other's sentences. Cedric Diggory was a healer at St. Mungo's. Dobby tended the Hogwarts gardens and occasionally visited Harry bearing hand-knitted socks that Harry accepted with the solemnity of someone receiving precious gifts. The world was full of people who were alive because a 19-year-old woman in an 11-year-old body had spent 7 years systematically dismantling every mechanism of Voldemort's immortality before he could use them. Rose hugged her goodbye and boarded the train with Albus. Hermione watched the Hogwarts Express pull away, carrying her daughter toward the same castle, where she'd spent the most important years of her life. Both times through, Ron took her hand. "You all right?" "Yes," Hermione said. And she meant it. She'd saved them all. Every name on her list, every person who died the first time was alive now. The cost was that she carried the memory of their deaths alone. The gift was that she got to watch them live. It was enough. It was more than enough. The train disappeared around the bend. Hermione turned away from platform 9 3/4 and walked back into a world where there had been no war, where Voldemort was a historical footnote rather than a recurring nightmare, where children went to Hogwarts and came home for Christmas and grew up safe. She had rewritten history, and every morning when she woke up, she got to see the proof that it had worked. That was worth everything. The end.